In this lesson, we'll take a look at Sculpt Layers and how they can be used to create a really flexible sculpting workflow. So here's our sculpted T-Rex. If you want to use this project file, it's lesson 03 start, or you can feel free to use the one that you've created. Hopefully you've added your own flair to the model as you've gone in and sculpted it. So what we want to do now is use sculpting layers to add some detail to our model, but without changing any of the base sculpting that we have. So in many cases you may want to add variations to the model that you may not be sure about, or you may want to be able to kind of combine those with other variations. And so Sculpt Layers are going to enable us to do that. And so let's go ahead and look at the Layers tab, and then we'll talk about what Sculpt Layers are as we go ahead and start to add these. So to add a new Sculpt Layer, you can see right now all that's listed is our base T-Rex model. So to add a new Sculpt Layer, we can go up here and choose New Layer, or we can go ahead and hit the New Layer button. That will go ahead and create a new Sculpt Layer. You can see it listed here. If we want to rename this, we can go ahead and double click here, and let's just call this Test rather. And so let's take a look at some of the options we have for our Sculpt Layer. We have a couple of icons over here, okay, and then we have an opacity column over here on this side. So what we want to do is now do some sculpting, and we want to choose this layer. So you can see that we can go ahead and toggle back and forth between the base. So if we were to go ahead and sculpt now, any of that information that we sculpt will be contained on the base mesh. But if we want it to be contained on the layer, we'll go ahead and just click on the layer. Okay, and I'll go ahead and get the sculpt and just increase my strength here a little bit, just to give us an example of what we're doing here. And so I'll go ahead and do a little bit of sculpting here just on the side of our dinosaur. And so that information is actually contained just on this level. So it's looking at the difference between what we've got here and then the base. If we want to go ahead and turn the visibility of this layer off, we can go ahead and under the eye, just toggle the little button, and that detail that we've sculpted will go away. Now all we see is the base. Want to get that back, we can go ahead and turn that visibility back on. Next to the eye, you can see a little padlock, and what this will allow us to do is lock the layer. So let's say we've sculpted in our detail. We don't want to be able to manipulate that at all anymore. So what we can do is just lock that layer. So now if we go ahead and try to sculpt on here, we'll get a message, could not edit locked layer, and we aren't able to do any sculpting here on this layer. So that's good for locking down particular details if you don't want to accidentally start to manipulate some things. The next column is you can see that there is a number 5 here, and that is telling us which subdivision level this layer is locked to. So if we were to go ahead and take this T-Rex down, for instance, one subdivision level, down to the next lower level, you can see that this layer name changes, and so that's telling us we can't do anything on this particular layer. And if, in fact, if we go ahead and try to click on that, it'll give us a message to that effect that this layer is locked to level 5. So we can only manipulate this layer at that particular level. Now, of course, we can create new layers at this particular level and then sculpt on those, but this level was created and sculpted at level 5, so that's where we can access it. So just keep that in mind as you start to create and manipulate your sculpt layers. They are associated with particular subdivision levels. Now we can also manipulate the opacity. So rather than just turning these off and on, we can actually dial the strength of these layers in. So right now it's at 100%, so it's showing all of the sculpted detail at 100%. If we were to go ahead and take this slider down to around 50 or so, we can see that this detail becomes much less pronounced. And so this is a good way, as you go in and sculpt, you can come in and now, let's say the detail that you've created is too much. Rather than going back in and having to resculpt that, you can just play with the opacity settings and really get the look that you want. Okay. There are other options for dealing with our sculpt layers here. If we right click on the sculpt layer, you can see that we can delete the layer. We can duplicate it if we want to create a duplicate and then do some work on that particular duplicate. We can merge the visible layers, and then we can flatten everything down. So once we've got everything ready, we can actually bake all of our sculpt layers down into our mesh once we've got exactly what we want. We can also import layers, and we can mirror and flip the detail on those layers as well. We also have the trash can up here. Let's go ahead and look at how we can deal with masking and erasing detail from layers. So for instance, I have this layer of this detail on the side. Let's say I want to get rid of some of the sculpting information here and just have the base. We can go down to our sculpt tools and we can choose erase. If we go ahead and erase, you can see that erases that detail back down to the base. So all the information on the base mesh is still there. We're just erasing detail from the test sculpt layer. Now that information is actually gone now. We've erased it out. It doesn't exist in the layer. But there may be some instances where you want to keep that information. You just want to mask it out. So you want to make sure that the information still exists in case you need to get it back, but you need to mask it out in particular areas. We can do that using the mask tool. So we'll go down here and let me just mask this out. And you can see that it's turning red, and that's because we have this little icon turned on. If we were to go ahead and turn that off, the red goes away, so we aren't able to see that. So this displays our masking. So what this means is it looks the same as if I had erased it, okay, but that information is still actually in that sculpt layer, so that if I go ahead and choose control, hit control while using the mask tool, I can actually get all of that information back. So masking is a great way to kind of get rid of some information but still keep it on that layer in case you need to get it back, rather than going in and erasing that information. Okay? All right, let's use a sculpt layer as for a little bit more of a practical example. So we can either right click on this or we can just hit the trash can to get rid of that particular sculpt layer. And let's go ahead and add a new layer here at the top level. We'll go ahead and name this something like scales. All right. And now let's say we want to add something like scales to the skin of this dinosaur. So what we can do is go ahead and choose a stencil. And I should mention I've also just imported some teeth geometry just to give it a little bit more life to it. And so you're going to come in with your project files. But what we want to do now is start to add some scales to this. And we can start maybe up on the head. So again, we'll hold down S to manipulate our stencil and just kind of rotate it into position here. And let's go ahead and get our sculpt. Make sure that we've got that layer selected. I'm going to dial the strength down. Okay, although we can overshoot it a little bit because we have the flexibility of working with that opacity. And then we'll just come in and sculpt through this, and you can see we can add those scales to this particular sculpt layer. Okay, so we can come in and just kind of draw this through. Okay, and then once you get to the end of your stencil, you're going to want to move it out a little bit. And again, you can see that you can kind of sculpt those scales in. Maybe we want to put a few up here along the head. Again, use your judgment. Kind of use whatever stencil you want to use if you want to use something different, and just add a little bit of variation using the layers that we've got. So maybe you want to add something different. That's completely fine. Okay, maybe we want to come down here, for instance, on the leg, and maybe these are a little bit larger scales. So we can come in here and just start to add those in. Okay, so I'll just real quickly do a couple of sections here. Okay, and just bring those scales in. And now all this information is located in our sculpt layer so that we can manipulate this. So let's go ahead and turn this off. And so looking at this, if we think, well, the scales are a little bit too much, I don't really want them to stick out that far, well, all we have to do is go ahead and dial our opacity down, and that'll kind of blend that back into the base. Okay, and then at 0 opacity, of course, that would be just like turning the visibility of that layer off. Okay, if we want to make those stick out a little bit more, you can overshoot the opacity settings on your layer. Okay, so we can emphasize that a little bit more if we want to. I'll go ahead and leave that at 100. Okay, now there are a few reasons that we can use layers. We talked about a few of those. We could also import geometry as layers. So for instance, if we had this T-Rex and we had multiple artists doing different variations, for instance, of some skin detail or something like that, they were doing some different variations on their own, we could bring those in, and we can just do import layer. That would bring those in as layers, And so all those variations would exist here, and then we could go in and using opacity, using masking, we can either use each look at each variation, or we can start to combine those different variations. So let's say we really like the head of one of the variations, but we really like the spine of another one. We could go ahead and blend those all together, which makes it a really powerful way to work as far as using a bunch of different variations, utilizing different artists to come in and create something that really looks cool and without a lot of hassle. Okay, so make sure to take a look at using Sculpt Layers for creating a really flexible workflow when you come in and do your sculpting. Okay, it's also good for creating, like I said, variations. If you had a couple of different variations of types of scales, you could go in and create a layer for each one of those, and then you could really quickly jump back and forth between those, and then you could even combine those together. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and continue adding scales via this particular sculpt layer. And in the next lesson, we'll talk about using vector displacement maps, new in Mudbox 2011. Those are going to be a really powerful way to get some complex detailing using a different kind of displacement map. So we'll go ahead and look at those next.